I'm going to start, as we decided, because I have this lack of fortune of, I don't really speak off the cuff. So when Martha wrote to me last fall and asked me to think about domestic work, and I started thinking about it. And so I wrote some comments out for this, but to continue the Martha and my exchange, last week I'm just confirming you still want me to talk about domestic work, and I think you mean trafficking, right? And I get back, well, if that's what you want to do, but I was thinking of domestic work. And I'm still like not getting it. And then I had this aha moment, right? I'm looking at it through my lens of international human rights work, where for me domestic work is the bringing in of workers to our domestic setting, usually in very exploitative situations. And she was talking about domestic workers and the way we've been talking about domestic workers. So that was my first switch point. That global and local intersection. Now, in this company, I think I'm probably going to have a different answer than I might elsewhere. But I want to start by asking a question. Who is Lilian Cordero? No takers? Okay, follow-up question. Who is Zoe Baird?
She hired a nanny and
Lilian Cordero. Invisible. We didn't forget Zoe. We haven't forgotten Zoe. We still know about Zoe and Nannygate. But the nanny is lost. It's the story of the invisible. Unspoken voices, unheard, unknown, incredibly vulnerable, but not in our sphere, if you will, not within our visual sight. We don't smell them, we don't hear them, and it's the them. So now that even in this company, nobody knew Lilian Cordero, let me sort of pull myself back and give you some thoughts about what we've been talking about here. This room is evidence that women have shattered some glass ceilings. Phoebe, Dean Phoebe, professors, activists, lawyers. This was not all that common when Phoebe and I started. A room this big got all the women in the academy of any race and plus men of color, and there would be empty seats. It's interesting that while we have made that shift from women's work to shattering ceilings so that we do traditional work, that was at one time men's, the domestic aspect is still women's work. And there's a very thin line between love and work, because that domestic work that we find invisible and often don't value, we have now started valuing for some of us in divorce proceedings. Right, so it's become real work. But for some reason, the domestic workers still lack the status, either cultural or legal rights, that all other occupations have, as we've been talking about. And this, of course, is reinforced by the lack of effective advocacy, which is changing, but also that thin line between love and work. The au pair who did not want to go after her local family, because that would mean she didn't love the children. But let me give you some quick figures. Domestic Workers United reports that 95% of domestic workers are women, 93% are racial minorities, 76% are not U.S. Citizens, and most of those are undocumented, and sadly illegal is the legal language that we use to talk about them. The domestic workers who are citizens are not protected by labor laws. Those who operate in the shadow of the law because they're undocumented certainly are not going to be protected. The situation thus is exacerbated for immigrants who are domestic workers, who are in a very difficult space and held to a very strict immigration quota. There's a lot of trafficking for domestic workers because, as we already heard, the visa situation is impossible. The domestic workers are part of the unskilled workers, and there's only 10,000 visas a year. And we know from all the law and economics and every other discipline that there's a supply and demand curve, and when the demand is greater than the supply, legal supply, we go to other avenues. And there's huge abuse. Aside from the ones we've heard already, it's also commodified and commercialized. In a case, U.S. versus Lubis, a defendant harbored over 20 undocumented domestic workers and sold their services to wealthy families, and threatened to kill the families of the domestic workers if they fled or if they told, and in fact, sexually abused two of them. When he was tried, he only got 3 years probation. And this is for 20. I mean, this is like an enterprise that he's running. Domestic work, however, is not just an issue here in the United States. Domestic work accounts for 10% of all employment in some countries and is the single largest sector of the economy that causes women worldwide to migrate. Yet, almost half of the countries, like the US, exclude domestic workers from laws limiting maximum hours per week, and 83% of the countries do not impose any limits on night work, and we see what can happen with the au pairs. The UK, Canada, Japan, Finland, Switzerland, domestic workers are excluded from minimum wage legislation. Greece excludes domestic workers from industrial accidents legislation. There's just simply no protection. So it's striking that feminism has been so silent in the process. I think it's growing, but I think it's been the problem of the different generations of feminism that class has been so absent from the conversation, hence the need for switch points. That immigration status has been so absent from the conversations. And it has fed into the ideological separation of work and home. I go out to work, I love at home. Who do I hire to replace me? Can't be work, because that's that guilt part of my brain that I need to protect. We need to talk about, we need to open up those connections. And it's happened along class lines, because it's been the well-to-do women, and also along race lines. It's the well-to-do who hire others to substitute for their work that still cannot come to grips. And of course, some of the stories about the identity, the last story Lane told, that make these things so significant. So we have the racial element of domestic work having historical roots. Prior to civil rights struggles, domestic work was mostly black, African-American women, and in fact, it was that racial component that had the original National Labor Relations Act be influenced not to recognize domestic work as work. Because of course it's okay to exclude blacks. And of course, sex was then put into the Civil Rights Act, as we heard this morning, to try to make sure that blacks didn't get the rights either, but that failed, and so we had a mess. And then industrialization affected the gender of domestic work, and now we have the gender and race coming together. As was noted earlier, the language we use is hugely indicative of the different perceptions we have. When we talk about servants, babysitters, or caregivers, we attach completely different significances, and we imagine completely different people doing it. That was another thought exercise I thought we could have, but we're not. But really, everything is interconnected. And what's sad is that we don't come together more often, and which is what's so invigorating about this meeting, is that we are coming together. think of this, and this Delegate Washington's story reminded me of this. During the legislative hearings, Diane Williams, the daughter of a Black American domestic worker, lamented the media focus on immigrants as something that draws attention from the plight of Native domestic worker. She couldn't identify with immigrants, and that helped deny the reality of domestic work, because here's a Black woman saying, no, not them. And so it all sort of collapses to hurt everybody. It has horrible results in the immigration code. Since the passage of the Immigration Act, domestic workers can only legally enter, as I said, before under the unskilled worker, and that just, we don't have enough. And that demand results into the trafficking. And the Trafficking Victims Protection Act protects against trafficking in persons, both for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. There have been two problems. One, it's the Department of Homeland Security who's in charge of checking against the trafficking, together with justice. And of course, the illegally trafficked for labor are not going to go to Homeland Security to be deported. And so that creates a problem in terms of getting any kind of protection. And President Bush's focus on trafficking was for sex work, for prostitution, and that was joined by a strange coalition of some feminist interests, and that sort of totally took away from the problems of labor trafficking. But some progress has been made. I believe Marley mentioned the 2011 ILO Convention 189, which finally acknowledged the role of domestic work in the paid labor market and established a human rights framework for looking at domestic work, and recognizes the dangers of exploitation within the field and the need for protections. Unfortunately, it's not binding. New York is the only state that has domestic worker Bill of Rights, and hopefully by next year, when we get together again in some way, Delegate Washington will make sure that Maryland is the second.
We'll do it together.
Yes, but you're the one with the vote. We'll do whatever it takes.
I hope that Governor O'Malley likes to follow New York State.
Yes.
Oh, great. So piecemeal steps are being taken, but they don't help all the workers, although they do start pointing us in a particular direction of change. But there's other switch points about which we've spoken that I think is really important. The undocuqueer slide that you showed earlier really moved me, because like Sheena, I believe it is, spoke earlier about the gay dreamer. In Florida, two of the leaders of the dreamer group is a young gay couple who cannot come out because the dreamers will turn against them. Notwithstanding, they understand the need to build coalition, but for now they have to be quiet, because family and friends and churches are all going to say no. Just like many of our Latino leaders in the immigration movement are refusing to support the bill that will allow in the immigration laws writ large, same-sex partners to be claimed. And which, results in having couples either split up, or we have a lot of expats, because since they can't regularize their partners, then they say, okay, hell with you, I go elsewhere. So we have the same GLBTQ issues about which we spoke this morning in the African American community, in the Latino community, and now we have a pope who was rabidly against the Argentinian measure to pass the legislation allowing marriage between people of the same sex, and in fact lobbied very heavily, lost a notwithstanding, but in the process is on record about having called gays and lesbians devils and pitying the children who are going to be raised by those devils. So there's a lot of tensions in the immigration conversation with respect to Latinas and Latinos, just like there is with the African American community, which makes me think then of the switch itself as a locus for focus. It is, as I think we have talked about throughout the day, the structural factors that alienate and atomize. Structurally, we have invisible people, vulnerable populations that are deemed to be disposable people. So the switch itself might not exist for them. We even have to go back and fix the switch. Go back to the very, very bottom so that we can raise up. And then remember what Chavez tells us about el pueblo unido jamás será vencido. People united will not be defeated. Thank you.